They say if you want to succeed, just focus. But what if your mind refuses to obey? What if every time you try to concentrate, something inside scatters your thoughts like pieces of broken glass? What if you want to stay still, but your brain is running at full speed, dragging your attention in 1,000 directions? ADHD, attention deficit/hyperactivity disorder, is often misunderstood. Most people imagine it as something noisy, a hyperchild running in circles, interrupting the class. But what if I told you that ADHD isn't always loud? What if I told you it can be completely silent? In today's episode of Whispers of Psychology, we dive into reality that most never see, the quiet, hidden form of ADHD that lives beneath the surface, the version that doesn't shout, but whispers. If you ever felt like you were too forgetful, too distracted, or never good enough, this might be the most important thing you hear today. Stay with me. This could change the way you see yourself or someone you love. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a version of ADHD that wears no label. It doesn't jump up in class or bounce off the walls. It doesn't get noticed by teachers or diagnosed early in childhood. Instead, it hides. It adapts. It masks. It lives in quiet. Intelligent students who look like they're paying attention, but are lost in another world. It lives in adults who work twice as hard just to finish what others do without effort. It lives in people who spend years thinking they're broken but never realizing why. You see, ADHD isn't always visible. It isn't always disruptive. In many cases, it's internal, a storm behind the eyes, a mind that drifts even when the body sits still. And that's where the problem begins. Because the world only sees what it can measure. It sees the grades. It sees the calm posture. It sees the person who shows up, but not the one who's struggling inside. And so, the person with ADHD starts to believe they're just lazy, or dumb, or careless. But they're not. They're just wired differently. Imagine this. You sit down to write an email. You open your laptop, click on your inbox, and 30 minutes later, you're deep into 3 YouTube videos, 2 shopping carts, and an unfinished Google search about the origin of honeybees. You snap out of it, angry at yourself. What's wrong with me? But that's the thing, nothing is wrong. Your brain is just not filtering distractions the way other brains do. Or think about this. You're given a small task, like returning a phone call or doing laundry. It feels overwhelming, even though you know it's simple. You delay it, avoid it, beat yourself up for not doing it. But that simple task is a mountain your brain can't climb today. And this pattern repeats over and over until you stop trusting yourself. You doubt your intelligence. You apologize constantly. You call yourself names no one else hears. Lazy, unmotivated, broken. But those are lies. The truth is, people with ADHD often try harder than anyone else. They develop routines, lists, reminders, alarms, anything to keep their world from falling apart. They don't give up. They mask. They fight, silently, because the world doesn't see their exhaustion. It only sees their mistakes. ADHD, in its quiet form, doesn't seek attention. It hides from it. It can look like a young woman who's always late. Not because she doesn't care, but because her mind loses time. It can look like a man who's disorganized. Not because he's sloppy, but because his brain processes space and order differently. It can even look like success. Yes, some people with ADHD are high achievers. But what you don't see is the cost. The sleepless nights, the anxiety, the burnout, the energy it takes to appear normal in a world built for brains that work differently. And that's the cruelest part of all. Because when people succeed, no one asks if they're struggling. No one sees the crash behind performance. No one realizes they're surviving, not thriving. So the cycle continues. They blame themselves. They burn out. They disappear into their own silence. But it doesn't have to be this way. Understanding ADHD, the quiet kind, is the first step to healing. To stop punishing yourself. To stop apologizing for things beyond your control. To start learning your rhythm and building a life around it, not against it. You are not your disorder. You are not your distractions. And you are definitely not broken. You're just wired to hear the world differently. And in that difference, there's beauty. So, if your mind wanders more than others, if staying still feels like a struggle only you understand, if you spent years trying to be normal and never quite fitting in, maybe you don't need to change who you are. Maybe you just need to understand how you work. Because when the world learns to listen to whispers, it finally starts to hear the truth. Sometimes, the most powerful signals are the ones no one notices. ADHD isn't always about what you can see. It's about what a person feels, often silently. You might not notice the distractions, the inner restlessness, or the silent frustration, because the signs that truly matter don't always scream. They whisper. Let's talk about the kind of ADHD that doesn't interrupt meetings or bounce in chairs. Let's talk about the one that hides behind routines, politeness, and a fake smile. The version of ADHD that blends into background. Not because it's not there, but because it's learned how to survive without being seen. You forget things constantly, not once in a while, but daily. Your phone, your keys, the name of the person you just met, the point you were trying to make mid-sentence. And every time you forget, there's a pause inside you, a little flicker of shame. You joke about it, make light of it, but deep down, you're tired of being the forgetful one. Tired of not being able to trust your own mind. You start tasks and abandon them halfway, not because you don't care, but because your focus shifts, your energy collapses, or something tiny distracts you. You open 5 tabs at once, only to forget why you opened the first one. You walk into a room and feel blank, then walk out angry at yourself for forgetting again. This is time blindness, not just losing track of time, but feeling time differently. You sit down for 5 minutes, and it turns into an hour. You think you have plenty of time, then suddenly you're running late again. Alarms don't help. Reminders become noise. Planning becomes a game of guesswork. You feel emotions intensely. A small comment that others would brush off stays with you for hours, sometimes days. Someone doesn't reply to your message, and your brain spirals. They must be upset. You probably said something wrong. You always mess things up. This is emotional dysregulation, one of ADHD's most ignored signs. You react too fast, feel too deeply, and struggle to pull yourself back to balance. But the outside world sees you as dramatic, moody, or too sensitive. You interrupt without meaning to, not out of disrespect, but because if you don't say what's in your mind now, you might forget it. You speak quickly. Your words sometimes tangled in urgency, because your brain is processing too fast to slow down. Or the opposite happens. You zone out mid-conversation, completely unaware that your mind drifted until someone says, "Are you even listening?" And you were until you weren't. Simple tasks feel overwhelming. You know what to do. You know how to do it. But you just can't start. It's like your brain refuses to turn the engine on. You stare at your to-do list. You stare at the mess in your room. And you sit there, paralyzed, as minutes pass and the guilt grows. People call it procrastination. But it's more than that. It's executive dysfunction. Your mind wants to move, but it's trapped in quicksand. You hyper-focus on strange things, sometimes staying up all night organizing books, watching niche videos, or diving into one task with tunnel vision. And for those few hours, the world fades away. Everything makes sense. You feel alive. But then the crash comes. You're exhausted. The rest of the day is unproductive. And again, the guilt creeps in. You mask constantly. You become a people pleaser. You try to seem normal in social situations. You take extra care to not let anyone notice how scattered your thoughts are. But that constant self-monitoring drains you. You come home and collapse, not from physical work, but from the effort of holding yourself together all day. You over-explain, over-apologize. You say sorry for things that weren't your fault. You seek reassurance, validation, understanding, but people get annoyed. They don't see your internal panic, only the surface. So you learn to stay quiet, to keep it in, to smile when you're actually struggling. And that's how these signs stay hidden, because the world doesn't recognize this ADHD, the quiet kind. The kind that gets mistaken for anxiety, depression, laziness, or even personality flaws. The kind that slips through the cracks of diagnosis. Because you're not failing enough to raise alarms. just enough to feel like you're always behind. And here's the painful truth. You start believing that this is just who you are, that maybe you're not trying hard enough, that maybe you're just not built for this world. But none of that is true. These hidden signs don't mean you're weak. They mean you've been surviving with a brain that processes differently. You've been working 10 times harder in silence, blaming yourself for not fitting into systems that were never designed for you. So if these signs feel familiar, if you see yourself in even a few of these whispers, pause, breathe. You are not alone. You are not lazy. And you are not broken. You're simply running on a different frequency. And the moment you start listening to it, instead of fighting it, is the moment you begin to heal. Some people spend years, even decades, carrying a weight they cannot name. They don't know why they struggle to do the things others find simple, why routines slip through their fingers like water, why their brain feels like a browser with too many tabs open, all at once. They grow up hearing phrases like, "You just need to focus. You're too smart to be so lazy. Why can't you just finish something for once?" They learn early that something about them is off, but no one tells them what it is. They're not misbehaving. They're not causing trouble. They're just different, quietly, constantly. And so they do what most undiagnosed ADHD individuals do. They try to hide it. You'll find them overcompensating, becoming perfectionists, obsessively organizing, double and triple checking things just to make sure they don't forget again. Or the opposite. They develop a chaotic way of living that feels like a storm they can't calm. Either way, they live in constant self-doubt. One woman once said, "I didn't realize I had ADHD until I was 34. I just thought I was bad at being an adult." That one sentence echoes louder than any diagnosis. Because for people who go undiagnosed for years, the real damage isn't just a struggle, it's the shame. They start to internalize failure. Every missed deadline, every forgotten birthday, every task that never got finished, it all adds up, and after enough time, it stops being about the task and becomes a reflection of their worth. They begin to believe that they're simply not good enough. Imagine growing up as a student who is always told they have potential. Teachers say, "She's so smart, but she just doesn't apply herself." Or, "He's got talent, but he's always distracted." And instead of wondering if something deeper might be going on, the world labels it as laziness, lack of discipline, or irresponsibility. But behind those labels is a mind that's constantly trying to manage noise, the internal kind. A mind that starts something with energy, but loses steam halfway through. A mind that genuinely wants to remember things, but forgets them anyway. And so, the child grows into an adult who no longer trusts themselves. They enter relationships and become people pleasers. They over-apologize. They fear rejection deeply, because they've spent years believing they're the problem. They think, if I can just be better, maybe I'll be easier to love. But their partners or friends don't understand why they forget important details or cancel plans last minute. They take it personally. And again, the person with undiagnosed ADHD blames themselves. Even in the workplace, the signs are misread. They might miss deadlines, zone out in meetings, or forget instructions, and it's seen as carelessness. But no one sees how hard they're trying, how much energy they burn just to meet the baseline of what's expected. So they stay quiet. They don't ask for help. They don't know how to explain the storm inside their brain because they don't have the words for it. Instead, they build systems around their chaos. Sticky notes, reminders, alarms. Not to get ahead, just to stay afloat. And then one day, they stumble upon something. A video, a conversation, a post. And for the first time, the puzzle pieces start to fit. Someone describes their inner world perfectly. The forgetfulness, the overwhelm, the guilt, the time blindness, the emotional roller coasters. And in that moment, a strange kind of grief appears, mixed with relief. Relief because they finally have a name for it, ADHD, and grief because they realize how much of their life was shaped by a misunderstanding. How many years they spent thinking they were broken when they were simply misread. This misdiagnosis, or more often, this absence of diagnosis, is especially common in women. For decades, ADHD was studied and understood primarily through how it presents in young boys, the hyperactive kind, the loud kind. But girls and women often show it differently. Internally, quietly, they learn to mask early on. They become the good girl, the one who doesn't make noise, the one who daydreams and doodles and zones out, but doesn't disrupt. And so they go unnoticed until the pressure builds up, until burnout hits, until something finally breaks and they can't hide anymore. The truth is, most people with undiagnosed ADHD don't look like what we expect. They're often intelligent, capable, creative, but they're tired of trying so hard, tired of the gap between their potential and their performance, tired of explaining themselves over and over, only to be misunderstood. They're the ones who function well enough to blend in, but not well enough to feel okay. And that's the story so many carry silently. But the moment they learn the truth, the real reason behind their struggle, is the moment something shifts. Because now, it's not about blaming themselves anymore. It's about learning how their brain works. It's about unlearning shame and choosing understanding. It's about realizing that they were never lazy. They were never broken. They were simply misdiagnosed or never diagnosed at all. And that realization, as late as it may come, becomes the beginning of something new, something healing. Because sometimes the greatest relief isn't in changing who you are. It's in finally understanding why you're the way you are. They say awareness is a first step toward healing. But what they don't tell you is that, for some people, awareness arrives late. Too late to undo the years spent in confusion, shame, and self-blame. ADHD is not a personality flaw. It's not something that goes away if you just try harder. And when it's not recognized early, it doesn't vanish. It hides. It buries itself inside the person, quietly shaping the way they grow, the way they think, and the way they see themselves. That's why recognizing ADHD early matters more than we realize. Because before a person hears the truth, they build a story around their symptoms. And most of the time, that story is not kind. They begin to think they're unreliable, inconsistent, lazy. They punish themselves for not being able to do what seems so easy for others. They become their own harshest critics, repeating internal scripts like, "Why can't I just focus?" or "I'm such a failure." And when no one names the storm inside them, they start to believe the storm is their fault. Now imagine if they had known earlier. Imagine if someone had looked at the forgotten homework, the constant zoning out, the paralyzing procrastination, and instead of scolding or teasing, had said, "Maybe your brain works differently, and maybe that's okay." The pain of growing up misunderstood runs deep, because without recognition, there's no support. Without support, there's no strategy. And without strategy, even the smallest tasks feel like mountains. But early recognition gives people something powerful, the chance to stop blaming themselves. It offers them words for the things they've been trying to explain for years. Words like executive dysfunction, emotional regulation, time blindness. Words that take the weight off their chest, not by making the struggle disappear, but by showing them that the struggle has a name, a reason, a shape, and most importantly, that they're not alone in it. When ADHD is recognized early, people can build a life that works with their brain, not against it. They can learn how to manage their attention instead of constantly fighting to force it. They can understand their energy cycles, their emotional patterns, and their triggers. They can find tools, therapies, and techniques that actually help, instead of wasting years trying methods that were never meant for their kind of mind. They can have better relationships too, because instead of saying, "I'm sorry, I forgot again," with guilt and fear, they can say, "Here's what I struggle with. Here's how you can help me. Here's how I help myself." Recognition leads to communication. Communication builds understanding, and understanding turns shame into support. But perhaps the biggest reason it matters to recognize ADHD early is that it protects self-worth. Because the longer a person lives with undiagnosed ADHD, the more likely they are to internalize their difficulties as personal failure. Every misassignment, every lost item, every social misunderstanding becomes another crack in their self-esteem. Until one day they stop trying, not because they don't want to succeed, but because they no longer believe they can. You see, early diagnosis isn't just about getting medication or therapy. It's about rewriting the story in a child's mind before that story turns into lifelong insecurity. It's about telling someone, you're not broken. Your brain just functions differently. And that difference isn't a curse. It's a key. You just need to learn how to use it. And for adults who receive that recognition late, it still matters deeply. Because even if the past can't be changed, the future still can. The shame can be replaced with self-compassion. The coping can turn into thriving. The silence can turn into clarity. And the person who once felt too much or not enough can finally feel like they're just enough. Recognizing ADHD isn't about putting someone in a box. It's about finally letting them step out of the wrong one. It's about building environments where they can succeed without pretending. It's about giving them access to tools that actually work. And more than anything, it's about allowing them to feel understood, maybe for the first time in their life. Because that understanding is what unlocks growth, not just in performance, but in peace, not just in productivity, but in identity. No one deserves to go through life thinking they're the problem. No one deserves to carry invisible battles in silence. So the earlier we recognize ADHD, the earlier we begin to heal not just the symptoms, but the scars. And healing doesn't mean becoming someone else. It means finally becoming who you were always meant to be, without shame, without fear, and without apology. So now, as you sit with everything you just heard, maybe something feels different. Maybe you're starting to see patterns in your own life, moments you dismissed, feelings you buried, the forgetfulness, the overwhelm, the emotional waves. Maybe they weren't flaws. Maybe they were whispers of something deeper your mind was trying to say all along. ADHD isn't just a label. It's a lens, one that finally brings clarity to years of confusion. It teaches us that what we often see as laziness is sometimes exhaustion from overthinking. That procrastination can be rooted in fear, not apathy. That being too sensitive might just mean feeling things more deeply than the world expects. To those who've lived in silence, to those who've worn masks just to survive, to those who work twice as hard to be normal, please know your struggle is real and your story matters. Because the truth is, ADHD doesn't always look like what we were taught to expect. It's not always noisy. It's not always wild. Sometimes it's quiet, exhausted, invisible, but it still deserves to be seen. If today's words made you pause, reflect, or even tear up, don't ignore that feeling. That's your inner self trying to be heard. It's not too late to understand yourself. It's never too late to heal. And healing doesn't begin with fixing who you are. It begins with accepting who you've always been. So listen closely to your mind, to your patterns, to your needs. Because in the whispers lies the truth. This is Whispers of Psychology. And until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and always keep listening to the voice within.